The Prehistoric House. In this lecture, I'm going to construct a fictive origin for architecture. The idea of origins is always important for architecture, but I want to stress stories about origins involve fiction. There's nothing wrong with fiction as long as you realise that's what it is and don't mistake it for truth or empirical fact. To find architecture's oldest remaining fiction of origins, we can travel along a timeline back to the 1st century BC. Here's a detail of the timeline, zooming in on the period around the 0 point. You can see the name Vitruvius marked in red. Vitruvius is an important name in architecture, so I will start by telling you something about him. Vitruvius was an architect. He lived in the 1st century BC, and he wrote what is today the oldest remaining treatise on architecture. There were other written texts before Vitruvius, but only his has survived. Vitruvius's treatise is called the 10 Books on Architecture. He dedicated it to the Emperor Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor and the heir of Julius Caesar. Vitruvius had been an architect-engineer in Caesar's army. In Book 2, Vitruvius narrates a tale about prehistoric human beings. It's called The Origin of the Dwelling House. Vitruvius calls his prehistoric humans the men of old, and he tells us they are born like wild beasts in woods, caves and groves. Their lifestyle is wild and uncultivated. Each man of old lives alone in the forest, and because they don't live together, they have no need of language. Vitruvius narrates how one day the forest caught fire and the humans ran for their lives. But they didn't run away permanently. Once the fire began to subside, they returned and gathered together around the warm embers and flickering flames. Thanks to this chance occurrence, the humans found themselves assembled together as a group. They started to make signs to one another, indicating how much they enjoyed the fire. The humans enjoyed the fire so much, they worked out how to cultivate it and how to keep it alive. The tale proceeds to tell how the men of old abandoned their independent lives and settled down to live together in the clearing left by the fire. Having settled, the humans developed new habits from their shared life. They began to fix on articulate words and to name things in common use. The result was that in this chance way they began to talk. At the same time, Vitruvius's narrative continues, the humans started to build simple shelters, using rudimentary building materials and methods such as weaving twigs and leaves, piling up stones, joining the branches of trees, and moulding clay into bricks and other shapes. Vitruvius ends his narrative by explaining how these basic acts of building eventually led to hut building, then to house building, and ultimately to architecture. It is important that you are aware of Vitruvius's story of how architecture began. However, in what follows, I'm going to present you with an alternative way of thinking about architectural origins. We need to travel further back along the timeline to a place for which there are no historical records, just archaeological remains and ancient texts. Although Vitruvius's 10 books is the oldest remaining treatise on architecture, it is by no means the oldest book to have come down to us in manuscript form. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are much older than Vitruvius, and it is to these that I now turn as a source of inspiration. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Iliad and the Odyssey is the way they forge a connection between the Bronze and the Iron Ages. The Homeric epics connect the ancient Greeks to their remote ancestors known as the Mycenaeans. Mycenaean culture flourished around the Aegean Sea between 1700 and 1100 BC. A temporal gap of several centuries separates the Bronze Age Mycenaeans from the Iron Age Greeks. The Iliad and the Odyssey are based on some events thought to have occurred around 1200 BC. The Iliad is about the sack of Troy, and the Odyssey is about one of the Mycenaean hero's adventures as he returned home from that war. It's thought today that the epic tales have some basis in fact, and that the characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey refer to real tribes of Mycenaean kings and their people. Although today the Iliad and the Odyssey are known as a written form of words, the epic poems were originally connected to their Mycenaean past by an oral tradition. The poems were stored in the memories of poets who would travel amidst the early Greek communities, reciting the tales to audiences who had gathered especially to hear them. The epics served as a collective memory for the Greek peoples because in them significant characters, places and events were remembered and passed on in spoken verse. And they also served as a social bond between the different Greek tribes and communities because through them all the Greek peoples would listen to the same tales and so come to share in the same imaginative constructs that mirrored the values and meanings of their lives. Now, it's not known exactly when the epics were first recorded in written form, but the name given to the person who's thought to have written them down is Homer, and it's thought that he lived in the 8th century BC. Now, neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey are specifically about architecture, but both texts are rich with scenes acted out in architectural settings. It's possible to work with these scenes, analysing them and matching them to the archaeological traces of Mycenaean buildings. From the scenes and the traces, it's possible to work out a spatial principle that seems to have played a structuring role in Mycenaean society. And it's this derived principle that I will use as the basis for an alternative theory of origins. The purpose of this lecture is to set the principle before you. And I'm going to begin with a famous scene from Book 9 of the Odyssey, the one where Odysseus and his men encounter the Cyclops. The scene is interesting because it not only describes the species of giant humans called Cyclops, but it also describes their houses. The scene is set like this. Odysseus and his men are sailing toward an island. They see a high cave set into a cliffside overhung with laurels. In front of the cave is a high courtyard built with stones set deep in the earth with tall pines and high-crested oaks. This court and cave is the house of Polyphemus, and he is a Cyclops. Cyclops are human, but the way they organise themselves as a social group is different to the way Odysseus and his men are organised. The Odyssey describes the Cyclops as an insolent and lawless folk who, trusting in the immortal gods, plant nothing with their hands nor plough, but all these things spring up for them without sowing or ploughing, wheat and barley and vines, which bear the rich clusters of wine, and Zeus's rain makes these grow for them. Neither assemblies for council have they, nor appointed laws, but they dwell on the peaks of mountains in hollow caves, and each one is lawgiver to his children and his wives, and they have no regard for one another. This passage needs special attention because it tells us about the things that Mycenaean people, like Odysseus, thought were important. By paying attention to those things that Odysseus took as evidence of the Cyclops' uncivilized behaviours, we can deduce the important values of Odysseus's own people. So, By deduction, we can work out that the Mycenaeans valued cultivation of the land, communal society, worship of gods. The Cyclopes seemed quite shocking to Odysseus because they did none of these things. However, what the Cyclopes and Mycenaeans did have in common was the capacity to speak and to build. And it's the way the Cyclopes built that's important to our interests in the origins of architecture. Now, one way to attend to Cyclopean building might be to look at the kinds of material processes involved, but we're not going to do that. We're going to forget about the materiality of the Cyclopean house and concentrate instead on the way it organises space. Notice how the Cyclopean house is formed out of two distinct parts, a cave and a court. The cave is an interior space, the court is exterior. But notice how the two parts are put together. The court comes first, it's a prelude to the cave. Keeping this bipartite relationship in mind, we will now turn to look at another scene from the Homeric epics. In Book 24 of the Iliad, there's a scene where the Trojan king Priam, helped by the messenger god Hermes, smuggles himself into the Mycenaean camp and makes his way to King Achilles' house. Priam wants to plead with Achilles for the return of his dead son Hector, whom Achilles has slain in battle. But we're not interested in what takes place between Achilles and King Priam. For us, it's the description of Achilles' house that matters. Achilles' house is a temporary structure built for him by his men, the Myrmidons. It is a lofty hut made out of enormous beams of fir, roofed over with shaggy thatch and preceded by an open court. Again, forget about the materials and focus on the way Achilles' house organises space. In particular, I want you to notice it has the same arrangement as the Cyclops' house, formed out of two distinct parts, an interior space preceded by an open court. I just want to pause here to say something about the social bonds that tie Achilles to his men. Just like Odysseus, Achilles is a Mycenaean king, and they are both related to the men who follow them in the same way. Achilles is the king of the Mycenaean tribe called Myrmidons, and their cohesion as a group depends on each member's unquestioning and unwavering devotion to their king. However, it's a two-way relationship, and the king is reciprocally bound to his men. They are not his servants, certainly not his slaves, and neither are they his subjects. It's the king's responsibility to watch over and to protect his men. The reason Achilles is king is because he's the most powerful member of the group, both stronger and cleverer than the rest. But he's also the king because his father was king before him. In other words, the role is hereditary. Returning to Achilles' house, as I say, it consists of two parts, a lofty hut and a great court. The arrangement is similar to the Cyclops' house because Achilles' lofty hut is, like the Cyclops' cave, an interior space, and the great court is, like the Cyclops' court, an exterior space separated out from the surroundings but open to the sky. At the start of this talk I referred to archaeology, but so far we have only looked at epic poetry. Archaeological remains are useful because they provide an additional testament to the connection between ancient Greek culture and its Mycenaean past, a connection that is accessible through the study of the remains of actual built forms. When we make use of archaeological evidence, we need to bear in mind the remains of Mycenaean buildings were only discovered in the 20th century. So in a sense, they are much more modern than the epic poetry that leads us to them. The remains of Mycenaean palaces have been found on sites corresponding to the kingdoms of several of the Homeric kings. One of the most significant finds is a palace at a place called Tiryns, which is on the northeastern Peloponnese in the area known as Argolis. Based on the archaeological analysis of what remains at Tiryns today, the Mycenaean palace seems to have consisted in a walled structure enclosing an aggregate of rooms. For us, what is especially interesting about the palace is the figure right at the heart of the complex, marked up in black on this plan. In the slide you can see a single-roomed building with a lobby and a porch. We call this a megaron. Within the overall configuration of the total palace complex, the megaron stands out as a clear figure. Notice it's preceded by a courtyard, which is in turn entered by means of a gateway. If we look at the plan diagrams of the archaeological remains of other Mycenaean palaces, we can see the same feature of the central megaron and court couple. This one is called Mycenae. The hatched line represents the palace wall. The megaron and court are at the centre, labelled megaron. This is the palace at Pylos. Again, the megaron and court are at the centre and labelled megaron. Now, as well as the archaeological remains of actual buildings, the palace coupling of megaron and court also appears in the Iliad and the Odyssey, where it is woven in and out of the narrative. The megaron and court couple appears most insistently in the scenes set in the palace of Odysseus. A very good example is the occasion where the goddess Athena first introduces herself to Odysseus' son, Telemachus. The goddess has descended from Mount Olympus to Odysseus' palace in Ithaca, where she appears to Telemachus in the likeness of a stranger. Athena finds Telemachus seated in the court amidst a gathering of suitors. The suitors believe Odysseus is dead, and they are hanging around in his palace to compete for the hand of his widow, Penelope, who, since she is a queen, is well worth fighting for. When Athena arrives, the suitors are playing games and drinking wine in the courtyard. Telemachus notices the stranger standing on the threshold, but he doesn't realise it's the goddess Athena. He takes her spear and invites her to come inside. The two of them pass from the court into the lofty megaron hall. In the quote on the slide, you can see how the Odyssey describes that occasion. Notice how the spatial figure at the very heart of the Mycenaean palace consists of the same bipartite structure that we've already seen in the Cyclops cave and court house, and in the lofty hut and great court of Achilles' temporary house at Troy. But the similarities between the palace and the two houses goes a little further, because the Megaron Hall too is an interior space, a fully enclosed room, while the court that precedes it is, like Achilles and the Cyclops' respective courts, an exterior space separated out from the surroundings by a screen, but open to the sky. The parallels between the central feature of the Mycenaean palace and the houses of the Cyclops and Achilles can be represented in a transformation diagram, as shown in this sequence of slides. It's this set of relationships that the title of the lecture alludes to, the Prehistoric House. The Prehistoric House is not an actual house, it's a spatial idea.